over the windows, electricity was cut off, and he credited this experience as having a galvanizing effect upon him, and he became even more convinced of the need to protect human dignity through legal institutions. Professor Basuni had been appointed to 22 United Nations positions, as well as acting as consultant in various states. And I should restrict my comments to some of the landmark leadership roles he has fulfilled in relation to recent armed conflicts, which I consider relevant to Ukrainian situation. So in 1990s, he was a chair of the United Nations Commissions of Experts established to investigate atrocities in the former Yugoslavia. In this role, he worked tirelessly to uncover the truth about what had taken place and to focus attention of the international community to this terrible crisis. He personally traveled all over former Yugoslavia, exhuming mass graves and interviewing witnesses and victims. And the commission ultimately produced 3,300 pages report dealing with ethnic cleansing, with genocide, with crimes against humanity committed during the war. And a further standout achievement was to have sexual violence recognized as a war crime. Professor Basuni had been particularly active in promoting peace in the Middle East. In 1975, he co-drafted a Plan for Peace, which was a precursor for historic peace agreement we all know today as Camp David Accords, which was entered into by Egypt and Israel in 1979. More recently, he was independent expert for human rights in Afghanistan, where he helped to rebuild a legal system by training 500 Afghan judges and advocating hardly to inclusion 50 female judges. In Iraq, he provided expert assistance with the drafting of new constitution. Professor Basuni is also a prolific academic writer. He contributed enormously to academic literature and theory. He is author of about 300 articles, 24 books. He co-authored 4 more books, edited 46 books, and he also had written 14 monographs on history, on politics, on religion, including Sharia law. And his publications had been cited as authority by various international tribunals like ICTR, ICTY, European Court of Human Rights, ICJ, and also domestic courts all over the world. And last summer, Professor Basuni really willingly replied to our invitation. He wanted to come to Kiev to meet with you in person and to reply in person to your questions. Later, unfortunately, in the autumn, doctors told him that he cannot travel overseas due to heart problems, and he said, okay, but I will appear at this conference via Skype, and we will have video conference, lecture, and conversation. Unfortunately, a couple of months ago, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he passed through a very difficult course of chemotherapy. Still, he had filmed a lecture for us, Renders, and after which he will appear in person. He expressed a desire still to appear in person to answer your questions, and I really hope you will have lots of questions, and I'm sure you appreciate generosity and fortitude of this great man. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sharif Basuni with a lecture entitled The Future of Post-Conflict Justice in Light of Contemporary Low-Level Conflicts and the Use of Automatic Weapon Systems. Thank you.
She said I'm going to speak on something on the future of light.
I didn't.
Not yet Skype, huh?
No. Film.
Пока не
Film.
Skype, film.
Which film? Sorry, some last moment technical problems, but we will overcome them.
Really long update. Everybody needs to know.
Well, we are very sorry once again. I hope now it will work.
Reasons unable to travel to Kiev to be present with you at this important conference, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to share with you some thoughts. And these thoughts are basically looking back at the end of World War II and how the evolution of conflicts has taken place in various countries. In probably the immediate post-World War II period, most of the conflicts were in the nature of decolonization, as countries like Great Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal still had colonies, mostly in Africa and Asia. The conflicts then, these decolonization conflicts, gave rise to two other types of conflicts. One of a geopolitical nature, when the United States in particular took the place of France in Indochina and expanded the conflict there in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But a secondary type of internal conflict, some called it low-level conflict, took place in Africa because those who were the leaders of the decolonization movement and who were able to help their countries free themselves from the colonial period emerged as the leaders. And they not only emerged as the leaders, they turned out to be quite ruthless dictators in many cases. And so you had internal conflict between these ruthless dictators and the local population, many of which have probably continued to date in some form or another. There was very little foreign intervention except in the Portuguese-speaking African countries with Portugal, but other than that, there wasn't really much intervention by the major powers in Africa. Neither, for that matter, in Asia, save for the American-Vietnam War. The number of casualties was always approximate. No one really knew in what type of conflict, how many people were killed, how many were injured, but the number was measured in the millions. And this then went on to take on a new generational form in what may be called as internal conflicts. For example, in Pakistan, the breakaway of the portion known as today the country of Bangladesh resulted in close to 1 million people killed. On the other hand, tyrannical regimes, whether they be in Ethiopia or other countries, also resulted in large number of victims, but nobody was able to do anything about keeping tabs or tallies on them because the international community, to a large extent, was disinterested. And not only was it disinterested in what was happening, which I must attribute to the fact that the international community is largely guided by Western European interest and more recently, of course, by the former Soviet Union and now Russia, who are looking at their geopolitical interest more than anything else. So, unfortunately, we are entering a period in which the post-World War II human rights movement that we had hoped so much for since the Human Rights Declaration in '48 has sort of gone down. And we're back to the 19th century power relations between state, realpolitik, and the fact that states are more concerned with power and wealth and their own interests as opposed to the pursuit of higher human values. So as a result, the existence of little conflicts, big conflicts, large number of victims, small number of victims, it really hasn't caught on with the international community, and that's why there has been very little in terms of post-conflict justice for all of these post-World War II conflicts. In one study that I did in 2004, I have tallied the number of victims of conflicts, including World War II, to 92 million people. And yet I don't really see where we have had these types of prosecutions. We have had, of course, the two ad hoc tribunals, the ICTY and the ICTR, for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. But these, again, were the product of the desire of the major Western powers in wanting to establish a rather narrow jurisdiction into these conflicts, each tribunal being an ad hoc tribunal and not part of, if you will, a built-up of it. And it did take quite some time until the International Criminal Court was established. And even so, one can see the resistance of major powers, including the United States, to the International Criminal Court and the difficulties that this institution has had in being able to investigate crimes committed in different parts of the world, or even pursuing mandates from the Security Council. My conclusion is that, unfortunately, our expectation that international criminal justice and international accountability was going to increase after the ad hoc tribunals and the ICC, but also because of the specialized mixed tribunals such as Cambodia, Kosovo, and Lebanon, and others. But it was, I think, quite clear to the international community and to these societies as well that realpolitik was the dominant goal and not the pursuit of accountability in international criminal justice. And with the present era of populist nationalism launched by certain contemporary politicians, has certainly gone against the values and principles of human rights, which include accountability for international crimes, and the pursuit of those who have committed those crimes. And so we are entering into a very difficult period in which civil society and particularly states who are concerned about international accountability and international criminal justice are going to have to develop new strategies and new approaches to work together in the age of globalization. But at the same time, there's another phenomenon that has developed, and that major powers have found ways to develop weapons that can achieve their goals without direct involvement of their military operations. So these weapons are, like drones, for example, cyber attacks, and who knows what other weapons technology will bring, which are going to be very difficult to detect and very difficult to prevent. One just has to look at some of the recent cyber attacks by Russia in the United States and in France to realize how difficult it is to be able to detect and prevent this type of attack. And we don't really know what more will come. Drones are probably the first generation of the type of automated weapons that states will develop. And we don't know if what will prevail will be the cyber type crimes, which are probably more effective and less costly, or if we will find something else. If we will go back, for example, to what was talked about in the 70s about using outer space in order to be able to attack different countries. So a lot will depend on the advance of technology with automated weapons that are capable of causing major harm and destruction, and whose source may not be easy to find. And even if the source is found, how does one discover who are those who committed those crimes individually? So is the concept of individual criminal responsibility that has developed so much since World War II up to now reached maybe a difficult moment in its history? What is globalization going to do to the pursuit of accountability in international criminal justice? Unfortunately, I'm somewhat skeptical, but I'm still very hopeful that civil society will be able to find ways of connecting with each other, and that like-minded states will also find ways to connect with each other and simply make it more difficult for the major powers who disregard the rights of other countries and other peoples and pursue their own policies of wealth and power, and that we will be able to, if not eliminate, but at least mitigate and reduce the harmful consequences of what seems to be developing in this new era of globalization. The international community, represented by the United Nations, for example, or the European Union or other intergovernmental regional organizations, have not started looking into this particular type of problem. There's no tally or census of conflicts in various parts of the world, or the number of victims, or how to prevent them, or how to reinforce national legal systems so that eventually national legal systems can take over the role of international tribunals, whether they be the ICC or specialized tribunals. I unfortunately am not in good health, and that's why I did not come to Kiev. And unfortunately, that is also why I'm not covering the subject with greater detail, because I simply do not have the physical energy, having gone through 2 rounds of chemotherapy after a rather severe blood cancer. So I would be glad to answer your questions and hope that this will fill some of the gaps that you may have. But bear in mind that this is a subject that has not been studied too much, and that there's very little known about it. And so it's very difficult to have objective data. For example, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the US has used drones for the last at least 7 years, the estimate is 5,000 innocent victims, that is, accidental victims of the drones. We don't know how many other people have been killed, and that's only in one limited region. And so it's a subject in which objective data is missing. Governments have no interest in getting this data. International organizations do not have the mandates of major power to do it. And it's an area that is still dominated by realpolitik. Thank you. I'm delighted to join you by cable. Unfortunately, for health reasons, I'm unable to travel to Kiev to be present with you at this important conference.
Well, I think we still have a couple of minutes, right, before Professor Basuni will appear online and will talk to us. Marco, would you wish to comment on what we have just heard?
I'm happy to, and the technical problems sort of while talking about the cutting edge technology issues somehow add a bit of poignancy to the debate. I think there are several major themes that sort of Professor Basuni developed. One is that currently we are experiencing a crisis of the rule-based international order. And that is a crisis that has many different roots. One most visible is ever-growing discord between the great powers, on which such an order in the realpolitik environment that he talked about necessarily has to rest. But there are also deeper structural issues. The fact that globalization benefited some people, but also did not benefit a huge set of people who are very influential in their own respective constituencies and so on. Clearly, the development he pointed to of a new wave of populist nationalist movements poses a major threat to that order. Whether we're talking about President Erdogan in Turkey or President Duterte in the Philippines or President Trump in the United States, they're not particularly concerned with values. I'm not sure whether you saw how President Trump had a nice phone conversation with President Duterte the other day, in which the first thing he told him was that he heard that he was doing some good things in combating drugs in the Philippines, and he congratulated him on his efforts. Efforts which I'll remind you took some 7,000 lives in extrajudicial killings. So when you have that going on, clearly we are in a crisis that, we do not know how it will be resolved or at what point. As an after effect of that crisis, you have the crisis of international criminal justice, which both is rooted in the big crisis of the world order, but it also has its own things. is it really worth spending, I don't know how many billions of dollars on this set of international tools that we know are going to be used only in a very, very selective way? We'll never be able to touch the vast majority of international criminals when we could be spending that money on, I don't know, providing aid to refugees in Syria, right? So there is a kind of a zero-sum game to it when it comes to political attention, when it comes to funding, when it comes to all sorts of things you need to build a functioning system of international criminal justice. And it seems clear that the ICC has not been a terrible success so far. Let me put it that way. It is doing stuff. Whether, you know, it is wise to produce 1,000-page judgments, and I'm talking not simply about the ICC, but about the ICTY and all these ad hoc tribunals, with the payoff we have had so far is a dubious proposition. So that's the second crisis. His third theme, which I thought was also very particularly interesting, was the developments of new technologies as also challenging the existing global order. And there are several things he pointed to in that regard. I mean, I have to express some disagreement when it comes to the drone issue. Drones are a fairly peripheral phenomenon, I would say, when it comes to the big picture of atrocities or war crimes or international criminal justice. Drones are a very high-tech tool that powerful states, normally states, can use against relatively low-tech enemies. You cannot use drones in a country which has a functioning air defense system. Yeah? Drones are a tool you use in a very selective category of cases. They are by their nature a weapon, a very precise weapon, but still a human, entirely human-operated weapon. They're not an automated weapon system. I mean, I do not think evidentiary issues when it comes to can we prosecute the operator of a drone or the commander of the drone operator for some horrible drone strike that took a lot of lives. I don't think evidentiary issues there are any greater than when it comes to regular airplanes and regular bombs dropped out of airplanes. Cyber, on the other hand, and proper, true automated weapon systems are a different story. And I think Professor Bassiouni is right in that respect. Cyber is notorious for posing attribution problems. Who did it? Yeah? Sometimes it is, you know, sometimes there's a paper trail, as it were, in the code. And you can actually pinpoint with a reasonable degree of accuracy who did it. Most often you can't. Thankfully, cyber has not been used until now in a way that could lead to mass atrocities of the kind we are most concerned with, or that international criminal justice is most concerned with. But you can definitely imagine cyber attacks being used in that way, for example, as part of an attack on civilian infrastructure and so on. But it is hard to commit a massacre using cyber, right? I mean, it is not a weapon that can be used for that particular thing. Truly automated weapon systems, you know, Amnesty International has, among other organizations, has this campaign to stop killer robots, which is a lovely way to put it, are a different story, but we shall see when we get there. Countries are developing automated weapon systems. There's no way to prevent them from doing so unless there's a treaty that gets that kind of acceptance, like the Chemical Weapons Convention or something like that. I don't think we will have that. But also states are not going to build Skynet and Terminator. I mean, they're aware of the dangers of that. So the weapon systems that they're thinking of normally have a human in the loop somewhere. The question is, again, how we get to that human. But frankly, when it comes to international criminal justice, our big problems are much more low-tech. You know, Syria, and 400,000 people who have died there, we don't have complicated legal problems there. The problem there is that people don't comply with the principle of distinction. If they complied with the principle of distinction, which is a fairly simple principle to grasp, hundreds of thousands of people would not have died. We know who did it, we can prosecute them. We are light years ahead in how international criminal justice looks to prosecute, you know, a little hacker visits or the inventor of an automated weapon system or the person who deployed the automated weapon system. We will get there, but it is, for now, it is 50 years away.
Thank you very much, Marco. I'm afraid you added a little bit more dark colors to the picture, which is not yet flourishing at all, to say the least. And I think now Professor Basuni is already online. May I ask if we can have him? And if... Good morning, dear Professor.
Good morning, Judge Anna.
Thank you very, very much for being with us today. We really appreciate the energy, and we all wish you a speedy recovery. Thank you very much. We have just watched the video, the film you had presented, you had filmed for us. And now, well, I'm afraid you showed a bit pessimistic picture. But still, there is a room for hope, and together maybe today we will develop this hope. I wonder if you wish to add something to what you had already said in the film.
Well, I think Professor Milanovic added some excellent thoughts. And maybe what I could add is that the history of international criminal justice has had its ups and downs, if you think about it. If you think about the post-World War I period, and then you go into the post-World War II period. There you have a big high, and then you have the Cold War, and then you have a big low. And then we pick up in 92, 93 with Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and we think we have a new high coming up, especially with the ad hoc, with the mixed tribunal that followed those two ad hoc tribunals. And then we have the ICC, and we think that we have climbed the Himalayas. I am not of that opinion. I think that the post, let's say, 1992 period, when the Security Council established the Commission of Experts to investigate the war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, this was a period in which there were very, very strong political battles between the Commission, mostly myself, and the real politiciens, as I call them, for lack of a better term, who operated mostly through the UN. And that really became the new avenue for realpolitik to undermine international criminal justice. It was no longer the frontal approach of saying, no, we don't accept that. It's, oh yes, we accept that, but. And then you say, but what? And you say, well, but we need resources, there's security issues, there are personnel issues, there's this, that, and the other. And you wind up realizing that all of these are really infringing upon the block building of international criminal justice. Now think about it for a minute. Yugoslavia Tribunal, ad hoc institution by itself. Rwanda, ad hoc institution by itself. Not the same statute, not even the same definition. Please look at the definition of crimes against humanity. You'll find it different in both statutes, which is amazing. And the idea of having these two juxtapositions dealing with two different subjects is to emphasize the diversity and difference of these institutions so that it doesn't accumulate and becomes foundational for something else. The same thing when you look at the ICC. The first 15 years of the ICC are not very promising for a variety of reasons. Maybe the whole approach of international criminal justice has missed an opportunity. And the opportunity, in my opinion, was after the ad hoc tribunals to sort of move international criminal justice from the international to the domestic. I realized that it's never going to be the same. If you include the 3 or 4 major crimes in the statutes of countries, whether it's Kenya or Colombia, you're going to have different applications. But you know, if you domesticate international criminal justice, if these crimes are part of national crimes, and the analogy I'll give you is drug crimes. Nobody thinks today of drug crimes being international crimes, deriving from international conventions. They're part of domestic criminal law. And I think this is the way to go. And the ICC should have made a significant effort in terms of training judges and prosecutors in the state parties to be able to do that type of a task, as opposed to trying to bring cases to the tribunal subject to so many limitations, the least of which is not the fact that the ICC investigators cannot go into a country where there's a conflict because the security office says, well, we have 0 tolerance. Well, you know, that's how, Professor Milanovic was speaking of Syria, and yet 2 years into the special commission established by the Human Rights Council for Syria, there's nobody who has gone to Syria. They're sitting in Geneva. And you have to ask yourself the question, how do you achieve international criminal justice when you subject it to all these limitations? Anyway, I know I took a little too long, but I wanted to, emphasize that, particularly after the very enlightened observations that Professor Milanovic gave us.
Thank you very much, Sherif, for these thought-provoking comments. Now I think we are ready to take questions from audience. Please, who would like to take this opportunity to ask Professor Basuni? Yes, please, just introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Mark Kirsten from the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. I know that you can't be here with us, but I think it's quite clear that your presence is here and felt quite deeply, so thank you very much. I have 2 questions, and perhaps the first is better explained as an anecdote. When they're not necessarily automated weapons, but when the 50 or so missiles hit these... do you want me to look in again?
The camera's there.
All right, I'm so sorry to you, but hi. Okay, so this feels really weird. When the 50 or so missiles hit, that Trump ordered to hit the Syrian air base, one of them actually went haywire, and somebody joked at the time that was the missile that cared about international law. And I wonder, in a sense, I guess my question is that a possibility in terms of ensuring that, in terms of ensuring accountability or preventing missiles or automated weapons from going and committing potential mass atrocities, essentially integrating ethics within them, making them think about what they're doing, or do we need to reinvent international law? And my second question pertains to this notion that Marco also elaborated on, which is international criminal law being in crisis, and in particular the ICC being in crisis. And I wonder if that's even a useful category, because I also read in your comments and in the ICC's existence that the ICC's never not been in crisis, right? It was in crisis when it was first formed. It faced a crisis from the United States, lack of support, faced a crisis from the African Union and from African states, and now it faces a crisis of global populism and geopolitics and so on and so forth. So Is crisis a useful category? And if it is, how existential is this crisis in and of itself? Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Let me answer the second question. I think, yes, I agree with you, the term crisis is not the appropriate term. But the problem is not a crisis problem. The problem is essentially a policy issue. What is the policy of the ICC? The first 15 years, I don't think I saw a policy. I certainly didn't see a policy with Luis Moreno Ocampo. I think that there were too many personality factors, ego factors, and what I would call international factors. The policy from the beginning should have been, how does the ICC transmit to the state parties what international crimes are and what the ICC is supposed to do about it? Because if it doesn't do that, and if it doesn't domesticate international criminal law, as I said earlier, then we're going to go from crisis to crisis. If you go on the website of the ICC, you'll see a map of the world, and you'll see different places where the ICC is investigating. And I suddenly saw the other day investigations in Afghanistan. And I got really scared because in 2003, 2005, I was the United Nations independent expert on human rights in Afghanistan. And it seems to me that the Office of the Prosecutor didn't even know that. Didn't even know that I had 2 major reports filed with the UN, one of which with the General Assembly. And I don't think that they understood the breadth of the problem in Afghanistan. When do you start? Do you start with the day that the statute of the court entered into effect and you forget about the past? All right. How do you investigate the conduct by the US? There's no way. When I went there as the UN independent expert, there's no way the US allowed me to enter into any of its prisons or any of its military bases or gave me a single item of information. I had to discover these things all by myself through people who would tell me these stories. How do I make a case? And if I exclude the United States, or if I have 2 or 3 instances of, like, the bombing of the hospital of Médecins Sans Frontières or something like that, people are going to say, well, what about all of the other things? And then how do I investigate the Talibans, the domestic ones who are Afghanis and those who are coming from Waziristan or other parts of Pakistan? What is their chain of command? What sort of crimes have they committed? That becomes also a very difficult thing because there is no way to investigate this. You have to go in the field. Now, I spent over a year traveling throughout Afghanistan. Beautiful country, very rugged, all divided in tribes. The people can be extremely nice to you. They will offer you hospitality and food, and maybe in the next 5 minutes they'll chop your head off. It's a very, very difficult environment. And you have to know the cultures. You have to know, why do I say cultures? Because each tribe has its culture. And how is somebody in The Hague who doesn't speak the language, who has never been there, who doesn't know the conflict, who has not the ability to investigate, who has nobody in the field, going to be able to produce the type of evidence that is going to be used in court? So, the idea of saying, the ICC is covering a wide range in the world, including Afghanistan and maybe Colombia and whatnot, You look at that map and you say, wow, this is really impressive. But, you know, you also look at how many people were prosecuted. I believe it's 4. And, you know, that's not much of a record in 15 years. And you have to go look at the reasons why. I don't think it's a political reason. I don't think it's a lack of goodwill on the part of the prosecutor, at least on the part of Fatou bin Saudi now. But I think it has to do with the system itself. You see, any legal system has to reflect the social values of the society in which that system functions. What social values does the ICC represent? We can say it represents international social values. We can say it represents, you know, higher social values that you can find in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, about the dignity of human beings, about, you know, the dignity of life and so on. But aren't these a little too ephemeris when you start looking at what's happening in different conflicts throughout the world in the last 30 years? You really realize that to be able to come and say, well, I'm going to have a commonality that will apply to everybody in the same way, and the evidence is going to be produced and obtained by my people in The Hague and those they talk to outside The Hague and outside the area of conflict. You know, I'm quite skeptical that you're going to be able to build a factual jurisprudence, if I can use that term, that is going to be something that can be built upon in the years to come.
Thank you very much. More questions? Yes, Sergey.
Dear Professor Bassiuni, thank you very much for being with us today. I'm Sergey Sayapin from Kazakhstan. My question is about a totally different topic, but it has always interested me. Could you please tell us the secret of your being so prolific academically? Do you have a secret of being so prolific academically? Dozens of books, hundreds of articles. How is that possible? I'm sure that many people in this room will learn from you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm in the process of thinking about writing my memoirs. And this is one of the questions I asked myself. And I really have to tell you, with a lot of reservations, that the first 18 years of my life were very difficult. They were very troubled. And the only way that I had to sort of alleviate the pain and suffering inside of me was to work late at night and to produce all of what I produced and to do all of what I did. That's one answer. And the other answer is, you know, I once thought very profoundly about, you know, the story of Abraham, which exists in all religions. So here we have Abraham, who has his first son, Ishmael, probably, as the legend goes, he's 90 years, 100 years old. And then he has another son from Sarah, Isaac. Sarah is a little jealous because Abraham is much more devoted to Ishmael than to Isaac. And so she tells him, listen, you have to take Ishmael and his mother and take them away. So again, the legend has it that he takes them to Saudi Arabia and abandons them in Saudi Arabia. And the story also follows that he has a dream, and the dream says that God wants to test him. And in order to test him, he has to immolate his son. He has to kill his son on an altar, like animals used to be sacrificed to idols. And suddenly, here comes Abraham with, this dilemma. Well, is this really the God that I believed in? Is this really the God of mercy and love who tells me to kill my son? Doesn't make sense. Maybe he's testing me. And I imagined Abraham saying, you know what? If God can test me, I'm going to test God. And I'm going to see if God will allow me to carry this act of savagery of killing my son, immolate him like an animal. And sure enough, at the last moment, God saying, I believe in your obedience and faith in me, and I will substitute your son with a ram. For years I thought about this, and you may find this funny or simplistic. And I said, well, why can't I have my pact like Abraham had it with God? And my pact with God was this. God, I'm willing to serve you on earth. I'm willing to do what is the right thing to do. God, make me an instrument of what you want me to accomplish. I don't want anything in return. I don't want money. I don't want positions. I don't want glory. I don't want to have streets in my name. I just want to have the satisfaction of doing what I think is a service to humankind, which is a service to God. And the best story I can tell you is I was in Afghanistan in my capacity as the human rights expert, and I discovered a prison outside Kabul, which is called Polisharki. It was built by the Russians. It was a terrible prison. It was not completed. The sanitary conditions were awful. There were 852 Afghanis and Pakistanis in that prison. These people had been imprisoned for 30 months. And I asked the director of the prisons, I said, why do you hold them? And he said, we don't know. So I went to the Attorney General. He said, we don't know. So I went to the Chief Justice. We don't know. So I went to the Minister of Justice. We don't know. So I went to the US Ambassador and I said, what's the story here? Is the US behind it? Well, sure enough, it turned out the US was behind it. Some 28 months earlier, they were in another prison, and apparently the US said, put a hold on their release until we can interrogate them. Well, these people spoke 6 different dialects. There were no such interpreters in the US. And so they remained lingering in prison for all of that period of time. Well, that night, it was 25 degrees centigrade, below freezing. Obviously, I didn't have any heat in my room. There was no running water. Toilet wasn't functioning. I slept with all of my clothes wrapped up in blanket. And I remember that these prisoners were in the same condition. And I got up from my bed and, in the midst of the cold, which was, a big sacrifice. And, I kneeled on the floor and put my forehead to the ground and I said, God Almighty, whatever you want to ask of me, ask. But you've got to do something to release these people. And the next day I went to see President Karzai, and I really made a big international scandals, including a big statement before the General Assembly, which embarrassed the US. 3 months later, I received a phone call from one of my collaborators. I was sitting in my office in Chicago. He was calling from Kabul. He said, "My dear professor, I have good news for you. Today, the 852 were ordered released." I got out from behind my desk, I kneeled on the floor, put my head on the foreground, and said, "Thank you, God." Nobody knows I was instrumental in getting them out. Nobody said, we'll honor Bassioni or we'll do something. I didn't want it. My inner satisfaction was to know that I had done something good. And if you're driven by that, then you know that you're going to push yourself to the max. Forgive me for saying that, but I'm sitting in front of you today with cancer of the blood, multiple myeloma, having done 2 chemotherapies, sessions of 21 each, and I'm going to do a 3rd one in another week. I am honestly not in a condition to do what I'm doing, but I consider that a duty. I consider that a service. And so to the extent that I can, that my energy allows me to, I'll continue to work and serve, and hopefully this will inspire other people to do the same, and that way we will be able to stand up against the Dutertes and the Trumps and all of the people that Professor Milanovic and others have mentioned or are on the minds of many. At this time, we're in a transition period. We really have to group or regroup to put like-minded persons together, like-minded institutions, and start developing a policy of common action as opposed to being split, by university, by institute, by association, etc., etc. We must learn how to come together and coalesce and be a force in the face of all of those who oppose accountability in international criminal justice.
Thank you very, very much, Professor. Well, enormous thanks for being with us today. We will not abuse your kindness anymore. We hope you will recover soon and you will visit post-conflict Ukraine, because again, we hope the conflict will be over soon, and we are very much looking forward to welcome you here. Thank you very, very much for being with us today. Thank you. It means we finished first day of our conference. I believe it was quite successful. We have our dinner at 7 o'clock. Otherwise, we will continue tomorrow in the morning. Thank you very, very much to all of you for your participation, and we will meet tomorrow.
And dinner is the
Спасибо.